Good evening, bonsoir, welcome to the Columbia Global Center. For those of you who have never been here before, this evening's performance is part of a series of events of the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, which is a recently founded institute for advanced study of creative and scholarly work here at the Columbia Global Center. And our featured composer this evening is one of the inaugural fellows, Zosha Di Castri. I'm Susan Boynton, and I've long organized a concert series, which is also the context in which this concert is taking place, as well as the sponsorship of the Institute and its series of presentations. We're going to start with a lecture by the composer, by Zosha Di Castri, about her work, her musical process of composition, and I will briefly introduce her. In the program, which those of you who don't have will get afterwards, in the program you have a lengthy biography that will tell you much more about Zosha Di Castri's works and her accomplishments and compositions. I will read a very short biography. So Zosha is the Francis Goelet Assistant Professor of Music at Columbia University. She is a Canadian composer. She's been based in New York for some time, did her doctoral work at Columbia and previously her undergraduate work at McGill University. And her works have been performed internationally. She composes for a variety of different formations, both large orchestra, chamber music, and solo, and has had quite a few orchestral commissions, a really impressive number from orchestras all over North America, and by the most important contemporary music ensembles working today, including the Talea Ensemble, the Jack Quartet, Ekmeles, International Contemporary Ensemble, and also the major orchestras such as the New York Philharmonic, Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the LA Philharmonic, the Canadian National Arts Centre Orchestra, Montreal Symphony, San Francisco Symphony. One of her most recent commissions is one that is also in collaboration with another fellow here of the Institute, Charles Guo, and this is for a choral work that will be premiered next month in the first night, the opening night of the BBC Proms. Most recently, we had the occasion to hear a work, multimedia work, performed in Paris, which was performed by the National Arts Orchestra, National Arts Centre Orchestra, which was her work Dear Life, and very, very large orchestral work. And Zosha is known for doing very interesting experimental and highly innovative work in multimedia, in mixed media of electronics and acoustical composition, as well as in pure acoustical composition. So I'm very pleased tonight to introduce her and to hear what she has to say about the makeup and mock-up of a musical process.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for the introduction. It's both an honor and quite a task to be the last fellow to have to talk after this year. There's been so many interesting lectures, and it's been really inspiring for me to think about composing from all these different angles, interacting with authors and academics and other artists. Before I launch in, I just wanted to thank the Institute for this opportunity, my fellow fellows, and of course the wonderful staff, Marie, Yves, Susan, and Grant for his help. During this talk, I wanted to give you a little bit of context about my music, what inspires me, how I go about writing. We'll listen to a few short clips, but we won't do too much of that because of time constraints and the fact there's a concert right after. And I'll speak a little bit about the work that I've been focusing on this year at the Institute. And I hope that you'll stay for the program with the wonderful ensemble Keln after. We'll have about an hour-long concert directly following the talk. Yeah, sure. So Susan has given sort of my official biography, but I know after speaking to some of my fellow fellows, they were interested in the more personal side of how I came to music, so I thought I would start that way. I grew up in a small town called St. Albert, Alberta, in Canada, in the prairies, and I started learning piano at 3 and a half. My family was always had an appreciation for music, but they were not professional musicians. So my dad was a closet drummer. This is kind of what it looks like around where I'm from. My dad was a closet drummer, but really a school teacher, and my mom taught music in elementary schools. So they were not professionally pursuing music, but they definitely encouraged us to play and to expose us to a lot of different types of music. Growing up, I would often sit at the piano and improvise and make up songs, but I never would have thought to call myself a composer. In fact, I knew very little bit about music theory or history before coming to university. I played, the standard classical fare. I was also active in wind band and jazz band, playing both piano and drums. I was quite a timid drummer, though, so I decided to let that go by the wayside. But this interest in improvised music, I would say, has continued through my work even today, even though I'm performing less and focusing more on writing. I was also quite active in dance and visual arts, or building things, and I think that has kind of trickled down into my work. Looking back, I would say there are two events early in my life that triggered a gradual shift from performance more towards composition. When I was young, my family took me camping to the Rocky Mountains, and my parents took me to a concert of contemporary music at the Banff Centre for the Arts. This is sort of what that looks like, which is also in my province. And I've had the fortune to continue to work there and teach there over the summers, which has been really great. And that was the first time when I was a young teenager that I heard and saw a female composer. And that blew my mind, that that was even possible. It hadn't occurred to me. I had never heard of any. I had never played any women's music before. My teachers had never spoken of this. So suddenly I realized that this was something that maybe could be a possibility. My teacher always had these two guys hanging out behind the piano. This picture of Brahms with the beard and the cigar, and then Beethoven with the hair and the scowl. And other than the fact that maybe my hair looked a bit like Beethoven, I never would have thought that I could pursue something like this. So seeing a young woman make bold sounds in this experimental way was very intriguing to me at that age. The other sort of formative experience was I got the chance to work with the composer in residence at the local orchestra in my final year of high school, and I very reluctantly met up with him for an audition upon prodding from my mother, and was embarrassed because I didn't really have the ability to write down with great finesse my ideas yet onto the paper. But he saw some potential and ended up being my first composition teacher, and after that I really got the bug, and when I went to university at McGill, started knocking on the doors of the composition teachers and trying to get more into that. During my time in Montreal, I was exposed to more avant-garde music, to theory, orchestration. They have a strong electronic music studio at McGill, so that became an important part of my practice. And from there, I went on to study in France here with Philippe Hurel, and then also in New York, as Susan mentioned. And in New York, although I continued doing acoustic and electronic music, I took a class in sculpture, which also was a huge revelation for me. It led me to sort of think about my music in a different way, and I found these projects really gratifying because they were so tangible in a way that composition wasn't, that I could work for a day and see something standing there, whereas in music it always felt very abstract, and then I would have to wait and I'd have to rely on other musicians, and I wouldn't really know how it would sound until 2 days before the concert. So that was really exciting to be able to realize my ideas in that way. So I'll just show you a couple pictures of some of these things. This was sort of a dandelion sculpture that I first made, where in the head of the dandelion there was a speaker and an accelerometer, and depending on how you would move the stem, it would control parameters of the sound. It was not particularly structurally sound. If you look carefully, there's a string holding it up. But it was a first experiment. I also actually, with the help of Jean-Baptiste, who is here, developed this work, which was for flute, piano, and electronics. And I started experimenting with how these sculptures might factor into a performance-type situation. So the idea in this, which was rather ambitious, I guess, at the time, was to have the flautist here and have the piano park inside this garage-like structure, and the structure could expand and collapse and be lit up in different ways. It also had to pack down into 3 suitcases because the premiere was in Winnipeg, so that was a challenge in that piece. And finally, this a little more solid version of a similar shape. But this was a hour-long music theater piece that I developed with my partner David Adamczyk, who's here, in the International Contemporary Ensemble, and it involved text and video and electronics and music. And we built this structure that was both an instrument and a prop that moved and traveled through the performance space and eventually opened up, and we built an organ inside. This is sort of an early prototype. And then eventually the structure closed and consumed the performers. They sort of disappear into this structure. So on this side we had instruments, hung percussion instruments. This was sort of an organ that the piano player would play. And I'll play you a little trailer from that project to give you a sense, although it's hard to compress an hour-long thing into 1 minute. So here, and so we're gonna play some music here now.
La vita antica fu tutta silenzio. Nel XIX secolo, con l'invenzione delle macchine, nacque l'uomo.
We'll stop that there. Maybe I should just mention that that project was inspired by the birth of high-speed photography and phonography, which happened more or less the same time, the invention of wax cylinder technology, and for instance, the type of photography that my bridge was doing. And so a lot of the texts were pulling on those sources. So I'm not only interested in just how music sounds, but also how it looks, what the body feels like performing it, and what our full experience is as an audience member when we attend a performance. I'm seeking ways to re-inject life into the concert hall, and sometimes it engages with a narrative, but often it's more abstract, dealing with sort of a general concept or cluster of ideas. I think that I'm also representative of a younger generation of composers who embrace a diversity of approaches and different influences in a way that maybe my teachers or teachers were not. And I think that's become more accepted today, and it's something that I appreciate in my practice, that I don't feel limited to only write one kind of music. So now I'm going to speak a little bit about the work that I've been focusing on this year. It's rare for me to have such time to compose and not have to teach and do other administrative duties, so it's been really nice to dig into some larger projects. The first of which in the fall was a piece for the Montreal Symphony Orchestra. I'll bring this back up. And this was the first time that I was writing for film, writing specifically to a film. The commission was to work with a 1973 film by Peter Foldis from the National Film Board of Canada. I chose that particular film called Hunger, and I wrote it for orchestra and improvised drummer. So that was interesting to try to combine something that's very, very notated with something that's free, and then also have the synchronization issue of dealing with film and how do you make certain moments happen at the exact time that you want them to happen. I was really struck by the visual style of this film and the strong social commentary, and I thought that it was still very, very relevant to today. And so that's why I ended up choosing to work with this particular film. If we go here, so you see the drummer right beside the conductor. I just sort of took some snapshots of the film to give you a sense of the progression, since we won't be able to watch the entire thing. But basically it's a movie that charts the progression of a man who begins snacking in his office, and you follow him through a journey of total gluttony and consumption. And he's unable to resist the temptation, basically consumes everything within his reach, including women. Here you see him where he's hugging a woman who turns out to be a fantasy and dissolves into a pile of pot and pans. And then the film ends sort of grotesquely as the now enormous man falls into a deep food coma and suffers a nightmare where he is surrounded by an emaciated crowd that devours him. So it ends with this, with them all piling on top. The movie I see as sort of a hideous testament to excess and self-indulgence, as well as greed. And I was also interested in how the movie portrayed women, especially in the wake of the Me Too movement. Yet, although it deals with a lot of sort of dark matter, there are these very comical moments in the movie, as well as moments of beauty. Whoopsies. So I'll play you a little excerpt of that. And shortly I'll talk more about my process of the movie. Yeah. This is from the very beginning. stop there. Gives you a little taste. All right, I would like to move on and talk about another project I was working on here at the Institute. Oops, I don't want to find a word. So I've been working on a debut album of my music, and so this has involved a lot of editing and mixing of projects, and I hope the album will come out in the fall on New Focus Recordings. And as part of this project, I returned to a piece of a solo percussion piece that I was developing with a friend of mine, Diego Espinoza Cruz Gonzalez. He told me I can't just say Diego Espinoza because there are lots of Diego Espinoza. And we've been collaborating together for a while. This piece we first performed in 2017, but he came to Paris to work with me in the winter, and we made a music video of the project together, which we're really grateful for Reed Hall for giving us the space. And that will be released as part of the album. And in this project, it's quite different than, say, my orchestral work because I got to spend a lot of time with Diego and develop the work in a more sort of intuitive way. And the score, even though it's a 15 or 16-minute piece, fits onto these 2 pages and looks like this. So it's not sort of your traditional notation. We knew that we wanted him to be able to play it memorized, and that we wanted to develop it in a more of a workshop style. So it's a very sort of fluid, almost choreographic approach to writing. This is really more of a mnemonic device than a score in the traditional sense. But you'd be surprised at how regular his performances are from take to take. When we did the video, I was really struck by how consistent it had become. This is what I call a storyboard score. That's not a technical term, it's just sort of what I've started calling this kind of work. And it describes a series of events using images accompanied by musical or verbal shorthand to give a sense of the overall form. And it developed for me by this kind of technique when Diego and I were working together, literally just a big foam board. When we had ideas that we liked, we'd find a way to write it down so we'd remember for the next session. We put it with tape so we could move it around if we decided that we wanted to change the ordering of things. This is sort of a close-up of that. So video really seemed like the perfect medium for this kind of a project since there was so much that isn't captured on the paper at this stage. Maybe eventually I'll go and try to transcribe it, but it's hard to know what should be left free and what should be actually predetermined. We worked together on figuring out the topography of the instruments, and a lot of this piece is about mapping gestures from one instrument to another. So I'll show you a short clip of that as well to give you a sense. We were interested in trying to see if we could make a scale of maracas that you could play like a keyboard or a typewriter. there. So that gives you a little taste. Part of our choice in the instruments was sort of playing with things that don't normally get put together, or finding new ways to play traditional instruments. So for instance, these instruments you see here in the center, these are kanjira drums, which are played in Indian classical music. Usually the skin is made with lizard head, and you can really bend the pitches, the gongs, the maracas, mixing them together. Very quickly, I'll talk a bit about the BBC piece that Susan mentioned for orchestra and chorus, which will be premiered this summer. It's entitled Long is the Journey, Short is the Memory. I had to choose a title before I started, and that title got a new significance when I handed it in on Saturday, and the journey felt long, but hopefully it will not be a short memory. So I received a prompt for this piece. Sometimes as composers, an organization will tell you they want you to connect with some sort of theme, and that was to do something with the moon, or the first landing of the moon, because the concert will be almost 50 years to the day of the Apollo mission. And I have to say, at the beginning, I did not have a lot of ideas for that. It wasn't something that particularly spoke to me. I think maybe that the fact that, you know, the way you learn in school that the world is round, not flat, and I had learned that people had been to the moon and just sort of took it as a given. But this project has sort of allowed me to find that amazing again. And it was great to get all the inspiration from my fellow fellows who sent me texts and poems and articles about the moon, and to speak with Xiao Lu, who we ended up collaborating together on this project. To see all the different people who have been inspired about this over time and from various cultures. So in the end, the text combines new material that Xiao Lu has written, also some fragments of a Leopardi poem, Alla Luna, and a fragment that is attributed to Sappho, but maybe isn't. I don't know, there's some debate about who it belongs to. So it's been fun to speak to the relevant people in our areas here at the Institute about this project. And Xiao Lu's text refers both to the Apollo mission, but also to the legend of Chang'e and to the recent Chang'e for exploration to the far side of the moon. This picture looks kind of gross, but it's actually interesting. Because part of that mission, they were able to grow plants in a sealed, self-sustaining biosphere on the moon, which is pretty amazing. It didn't last because the lunar night is 14.5 Earth days, and it goes to temperatures below 100 degrees Celsius. But the experiment proved that the project could potentially be feasible and could have significant impact. So the text also draws from that experiment, which we were both inspired by. But now, before we run out of time, I'm going to speak a little bit about process, since that's what the title of the talk said we were going to talk about. So usually when I begin a piece, I start with a vague abstract idea. I'll have some words or little gestures jotted down. And then the next step for me is to make a formal plan. So this is my formal plan for Hunger, the film that I had showed you. In this case, I had the film to work from, so a lot of it was analyzing where the scenes are, where the more logical breaks were, whether there were parallels in different points. And then I sort of come up with certain musical parameters. So this is a zoomed in thing. I would think about how I was going to control density or tension, register, that sort of thing at this stage. But it's really just a roadmap. I allow myself a lot of flexibility to move and have detours. But it's easy when you're focusing just on one measure to sort of lose sight of where you're going. And I always found that it was really helpful for me to have this kind of a global formal mat. This is for the moon piece, for instance. That's another type of thing. For Hunger, I also had this spreadsheet because I knew that there were specific moments where I wanted the music to really line up with the image. I didn't want it to Mickey Mouse throughout the piece, but I did want to have some points of convergence. So I notated very specifically at this second something happens, and it needs to correspond in the music. After this, I begin to work not in a score, but in what I call a mock-up. So a mock-up is basically a tool that enables one to test out your ideas, either as a rough sketch, or really it could be a super detailed, full-scale prototype of what the work is going to be. And I see this really as a place to play, a place to experiment. It's allowed me to be much more flexible in my thinking about form and to test out ideas that I might have thought were too risky to do if I didn't know what they were going to sound like. So it's basically a computer program. We call them digital audio workstations. That's the fancy word for composers. And it allows you to compose from sound itself. So you have immediate sonic feedback, which is pretty amazing to have. I use a mix of commercial sound banks and also sound files that I've gathered over time. So I sort of see my hard drives with sound files as sort of a personal passport, where I have recordings of all the people I've worked with that I've edited down into usable chunks, and then they become part of my language moving forward. If I zoom in here, well, here you see that time is this way, so you can measure time in terms of seconds or time in terms of bars and beats and measures. Yeah, I could see the film there, and then I'd have all the instruments down this way. If we zoomed in, for instance, you could see the bass clarinet, and I would play in on my keyboard what I wanted the bass clarinet to do. And if you open up in a different view, you can see these are the notes. The longer they are, the longer the note is, and the colors correspond to how loud or soft the sound is. I think that if Stravinsky was alive today, this is how he would have composed, because he often had these scrapbooks where he would have these little ideas and he'd tape them and move them around. So I sort of see it as a natural extension in 21st century music, thinking of working in this way. Another thing that's maybe a little bit particular about my way of composing is I don't usually compose chronologically or linearly, and this tool has made it much easier for me to do that. I think when I felt I had to put it immediately to the page, that was a little bit limiting to know, well, this might be the end, but it might not be, it might be the beginning. So it gave me that flexibility. It also gave me a productive distance. So in some pieces, for instance, when I write for the piano, I find my hands really gravitate towards patterns that I've played before. So by then moving it towards the software, I can break those sort of inclinations and do things that I wouldn't necessarily have done if I was sitting in front of my instrument. And then the final part, which is sort of the most arduous part, is finding a way to transcribe those ideas to something that musicians can interpret and read. So for those of you who aren't composers or musicians, you would make a conductor's score where they would see what everybody does, and then you would also have to extract parts, which each individual musician would be playing from. And that, I think, is actually similar to an active translation. I was thinking about Karen's presentation about how you take one idea and have to find a way to make it understandable to people in another format. Just quickly here, I wanted to show one more video. This is from another piece of mine, but one of the sort of interesting side effects of working this way, I realized, is I could kind of have a time lapse of my creative process because I save multiple versions of the project that I'm working on. So this is just 1 minute, but you'll see this is for an older piece of mine, how the ideas sort of form on the page, end up getting moved around, and the way I use the color coding helps you sort of visualize how that's happening. So let's just quickly listen to that. So these might be separated by weeks of work, but you start to see certain ideas reappear or get expanded. So that kind of gives an idea of how that would evolve over time. So this is definitely not the way that every composer works, but it is the way that I've sort of found to move my work forward. I'm definitely interested, though, in reflecting more and continuing to talk to other artists about how mock-ups function, what their strengths and also what the constraints of working this way might be. Particularly, how do these tools shape our writing? And I think that goes for any form of writing. What the tools that you're using, even if it's just paper and pencil versus laptop or other, have a way of determining the kinds of things we write about, and in my case, the sound itself. I'm also interested in who the mock-ups are for and how they're circulating, how they're being used. You know, sometimes conductors will ask me for these things, or potential presenters. So that's another way that they are having an impact. So for me, this is part of a larger ongoing discussion that I hope will continue to be had. Looking at the time here, I was going to say a very brief introduction to the concert, but there are program notes, so I'll just tell you that there are 4 pieces. It's a program that will be under an hour long with wonderful musicians. There's a solo violin piece, a string quartet, a duo for piano and violin, which is in 3 movements, and an octet, basically double string quartet, double the power. So thank you for being such an attentive audience, and I would welcome questions at this time. Yeah, I can also take questions in French if that's preferred.
Sorry.
Yes.
Je parle français ou...
Oui, ça va.
Est-ce qu'on pourrait écouter les sons de la simulation de votre pièce?
En fait, vous avez la pièce orchestre, le premier Hunger, le film que je vous ai joué, c'était un mock-up parce que l'enregistrement était détruit pendant le concert. C'était inutilisable, donc je vous ai joué le mock-up. So he asked would I be willing to play what the mock-up sounded like, and I did a little something sneaky because when I played you the film, I actually played you the mock-up, not the actual orchestra playing. Some of you may have realized, some not, but the way the concert was recorded, sadly, in Montreal, the recording was such a poor quality that it's pretty much unusable. It was a good performance, I'll just clarify that, but the recording was not usable.
So, you still want to go to the orchestra after the markup. Isn't there a point maybe where you would dispense with the orchestra, or is there something, you know, because some people just make purely electronic music. I mean, you're still wedded to the orchestra? I do a mix.
I mean, I do some electronic music, but it's a good question. There is an amazing sound that you get from a live orchestra that's not the same. I guess writing to film is different because it could kind of sustain itself without having a live performance. And then sometimes the performance circumstances are such that it can be frustrating, where, you know, for that piece I had 25 minutes one day, I had half an hour the next day, a run through in the concert after spending months of my life working on that. It was basically, you know, we read it through a couple times and we perform it. So it would be more ideal to have situations like with a piece with Diego where we could spend 2 weeks together every day working. So the jury is out for orchestra. I think sometimes I wonder whether it's worth it, but I mean, having a group of live musicians like you'll see tonight, it can have such vibrancy and that sort of connection. I'm excited about that collaboration. Other questions?
So thank you very much. There will actually be time after the concert if you wanted to ask more questions of the composer. And I think we will have a transition now to the concert, which will be at 8. I usually open by thanking welcoming the audience and mentioning the sponsors. There are very many sponsors for the concert this evening, so what I would like to ask you to do is to look at the back of your program, where they are all listed, and some of them are sponsors of the Ensemble Kern, some of them are sponsors of funding that we have here. The Institute and the Global Centers are in the front, there are some of them, and you can see the logos as well. And I want to express my great appreciation to Zosha for organizing this fantastic concert, and looking forward to hearing the music. And so we'll just take a few minutes to sort of turn off the projection, make sure everybody has a program, welcome the group on stage. Thank you very much, Zosha.
Thank you.